In this video I'm going to be looking at single-player mods for the original Half-Life. We're going to be looking at how they all use the same toolset of the Gold Source engine to produce wildly different creative results. These mods run the whole spectrum, from unofficial sequels to really random weird stuff that I don't think you'd expect unless you already knew about it. Anyway, let's get deeper.
Half-Life was a revolutionary title when it came out, but the game itself was only half the revolution. One of Half-Life's greatest legacies isn't the elements of its own design, the professional Half-Life experience, but the legacy of hundreds of modders who took the programming tools of Half-Life and lovingly crafted their own visions of what could be done with the Gold Source engine. Some of them have nothing to do with Half-Life, others seek to make unofficial expansions to the story, and still others strike a balance between elements of the base game and their own creative priorities. Ross Smith's Timeline is one of those sorts. It takes Gordon Freeman, the teleporter experiments, and then moves them in new and exciting directions. The first timeline mostly uses textures and animations from the vanilla Half-Life, but it's a particularly bright and memorable example of the early exploratory work being done by modders. Ross Smith made a trilogy out of Timeline, and each mod outdoes the last by a good margin. Timeline 1 is comparatively short and quaint, and that is much of the charm. Unlike the official expansions, like Opposing Force, single-player mods have all kinds of rough edges, janky bits, and moments of glaring cheapness. The fun of these visible seams is that you actually get to see how everything was stitched together. Where a polished game seems right in a general way and demands a little picking apart to see how it all comes together, these one-man shows in the single-player mod scene wear their designs right on their sleeves. Timeline 1 is a big, but slightly hesitant step away from Half-Life, and Smith struggles with making his levels express everything that he's trying to get across. His ambition is larger than his skill, right here in the first installment. In it, Gordon Freeman is doing more teleporter experiments at Black Mesa when he's attacked by Nazis from another dimension. Instead of leading to Zen, they had tunneled into a dangerous alternate reality. Over the course of the mod, Freeman journeys from Black Mesa to a Third Reich version of the same, uses that teleporter, and disrupts Nazi experiments in ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, and the American Civil War. It's a good 3 hours of play for the mod. Everything takes place over an extended period of time and over a long journey through the maps, and in regards to the pacing, Smith really nailed the feeling of classic Half-Life. Ultimately, though, it's that fidelity to the base game that's the big negative for Timeline 1. The corridors and soldiers don't distinguish themselves well, they feel generic. When Smith is making his own textures and being clever with the look and feel of a level, particularly notable in the Rome and Egypt levels, it's a hoot. It feels engaging and distinct, albeit in a way that's handicapped by the fact that he's using, essentially, a deluxe version of the Quake engine. But I'm drawn in by it, especially by its simplicity. Obviously, no one would ever say that Timeline 1 has a graphically vivid depiction of the distant past, but as far as its coherency and charisma as a game go, those elements run strong. The other thing that distinguishes Timeline from Half-Life is that it's designed for enthusiasts and skilled players, so crafts its combat encounters and item placement in a way that's much harsher and less forgiving than the original campaign. Ammunition is particularly scarce, as is health, and you'll have to be miserly about both from the very beginning to the end to get through the experience alive. Similarly, the level design is a little vague at times in terms of flow. It isn't as interested in telegraphing where you should go as much as something for a wider audience. This is for people who want complexity in map making, and buddy, you got it. Ross Smith, even in this first mod, has a flair for mazes. The space always seems logical, part of a larger unseen whole, but it's still clearly meant to get the player thinking and doing some fancy footwork to actually advance through it. Plus, Smith has an excellent sense of rhythm as a level designer, moving very swiftly between different design aesthetics and layouts, chaotic underground cavern, branching facility corridors, and the goofily small Nazi-controlled White House. The White House is actually a great little piece of mod-making in microcosm. It's not remotely designed to be a realistic stand-in for the original in terms of space and scale, but it's just similar enough to give the impression of the place, to have the player go along with it and say, okay, Nazis in the White House, obviously a problem. It accomplishes the same kind of world-building and expression of place as a more professional title, it just does so with an absolute minimum of resources. There's something so compelling in that. How big a story can you tell with the smallest of resource investments? That's not saying Smith didn't invest himself in the project. He absolutely did. But come on, this is clearly the community theater version of Half-Life. It's not a retail product. It's a gift from a fan with his own vision to other fans hungry for more Half-Life. That's why it's safe to call Timeline 1 worthwhile, even after almost 2 decades. It's an enthusiastically goofy, incredibly detailed game experience done by one man with leftover bits and pieces from the original game and a handful of custom elements. Timeline 1 was also one of the first major single-player mods, coming about a year after the original Half-Life did. As the scene grew in scope and ambition, so too did Ross Smith's Timeline mods. Timeline 2, The Iced Earth, supposes that, having seemingly stopped the time-traveling Nazis in the last game, Freeman is called upon by the G-Man to address another threat from an alternate reality. In another Black Mesa, on another Earth, an ice age has been consuming the world for hundreds of years. When the experiment opened a portal to Zen, like in the primary game, the frozen world was easy picking for the interdimensional invaders. The Freeman in that world is already dead. So it's up to you to finish what a different you started and save the world for the first time again. Iced Earth immediately puts you in a setting that's a lot different from the last mod in the series, and it does a great job of catching attention right away. There's nothing quite like Timeline 2 anywhere else in the mod community, very little like it in gaming at large. Timeline 3 goes in a more traditionally H.G. Wells kind of a direction, and the first Timeline is a little amateurishly simple in the setup, but the second one hooks into a totally different pacing setup than the others and does really well by it. Instead of weaving your way from epoch to epoch, you're in for a globe-trotting adventure that mostly stays in the Frozen's post-apocalypse. Towards the end of the mod, there's more stuff with Zen and the Nazis, but those elements get much more attention and are explored better in Timeline 3. I want to focus on Timeline 2's outstanding world-building and creativity in the Neo Ice Age you're in for the bulk of the mod. You begin in the alternate universe version of the Black Mesa facility, but Smith's gone out of his way this time around to make sure that it feels genuinely different from the original Black Mesa. The machinery is bulkier, less impressive, the trams are more cheaply produced. There are more distinct buildings as opposed to the endless sprawl of corridors of the classic Black Mesa facility. Architecturally, this alternate Black Mesa is much more vertical and scaled down to human sizes. Really, it's no wonder that the aliens mopped up so easily. It's kinda small. It gives the impression of a harsh and frozen world that was just barely hanging on before the invasion. It's been stuck in my memory ever since I played it years and years ago, and I was surprised about how much of Timeline 2 was still familiar when I replayed it. A lot of the cheapness of Timeline 1 is gone, and what's done with the architecture in Timeline 2 is as novel as it is interesting. Within the facility, you find a rocket that will carry you into space, where you dock at an orbital platform. The space station sequence is the most amateurish looking of the mod, kind of a blocky derivative vibe. You're out of there pretty quick, though, and then on to the game's best sequence, where you rocket back to Earth and look for survivors in what's left of London. The London levels are a beautiful experiment in urban level design on a severe labor budget. Like the White House in Timeline 1, London can only suggest the space, not compellingly demonstrate it, but it's a hell of a strong suggestion. From your crash site on the city's outskirts, the dead cities take shape in your mind as you take the limited and linear journey that Smith had the time and ability to put into the mod. It's more than enough. From the sun shining through the windows of a shuttered bank, to the new deep background textures of twisted, broken skyscrapers, to jumping a truck across a scaled-down London bridge, Gordon Freeman in Ice Age London turns out to be kind of a genius idea. The only downside is the difficulty. Even more than the first, you seem to run up against many more enemies than you actually have bullets for. Since Half-Life 1 isn't shy about draining your health out very quickly even on the easier difficulties, this can mean repeating a lot of segments. The thing about a mod like this is that it's fun and compelling to appreciate in aggregate. All the good moments, the surprising moments, the moments where you felt like you tuned in to what the modder was trying to let you experience. Moment to moment, though, you're doing the same old Half-Life song and dance in a lot of sparsely decorated rooms and corridors. In the immediate moment, it's not always so fun. Getting stuck is a serious bore in Timeline 2, and because of the item scarcity problem, to really come out ahead, you might have to go back 2 or 3 combat encounters and not just one, supposing you actually saved your game back then and such. Designing at an expert level of difficulty is part of what makes Ross Smith's level so individual to him, though. This is the way that Smith thinks that combat should be paced. High tension, high stakes, all the time. No good comes from bumbling around. The game tells you that the fate of worlds is on the line, so you better goddamn well aim your gun like it is. Ultimately, the miserly item placement does make your progress feel hard-won, and since you travel so far in terms of miles over the course of the mod, it does add weight to your journey. At the end of London, you fight your way into the tube and board a bullet train to Switzerland. The game even depicts your rail journey in brief montage. All with mostly custom textures and resources, not just the standard Half-Life toolset. Timeline 2, The Iced Earth, is a major part of the reason I wanted to do this video, on account of this tremendous expression of scope using these very slim resources. It just doesn't seem right to me that something with such craft and considered design should be forgotten and collect dust. These mods are every bit as worth spending time on as a cult classic movie from the black and white era. Yeah, the special effects are dated, but the sense of true passion is still woven throughout. Timeline 3 is something else entirely. It takes the best of both mods. It takes the epic scope of your journey and focus on urban design and extreme architecture that characterizes Timeline 2, and mixes in the playfulness of plot and level sequencing as you move through time from the original mod. It is superior to both, though, and I'd consider it my favorite Half-Life 1 mod of them all. It's the ferocity of vision Ross Smith has for his trilogy that makes it so unique and incredible. He explores 7 distinct and sprawling time periods, from late 19th century London to the year 5 billion and beyond, and finally back around to Black Mesa in 1998, where Smith loops his trilogy in with the original Half-Life campaign in the climax. It's not the most technically polished mod. Its ambition wasn't to make the best-looking Gold Source mod. Its ambition was to finish off the story in as grand a style as possible for essentially a one-man team. Bigger scope, better art, harder gunfights, gargantuan buildings, and unlike many mods, it gets better and better as it goes along, building from one thing and looping in on itself in brilliant ways. Timeline 3 is a magnum opus of mod design. Timeline 1 feels like a concept test. Timeline 2 is very interested in its particular alternate reality and not the wide variety of the first. This climactic mod is the result of great passion and great editorial insight. Smith clearly looked at his previous work very carefully, understood what rhythms worked, which fell flat, and had become confident and skillful with making custom art for the engine. The first hour of the mod is good, taking place in the Nazis' home timeline where a savage twilight across Nazi skyscrapers sets a powerful mood, but there's a lot of backtracking and looking around for keys, futzing around in utility corridors, familiar tropes that show that the mod hasn't hit its creative stride. What's likable about it is Smith's fondness for loops. One of the last areas of the game is actually right below the prison you start in, behind a locked door. Smith will give you a very large space, and then give you an idea of how it might logically connect behind the scenes, and then, after a lot of twists and turns and misdirection, you find yourself popping out where you thought you might end up when you first started looking, ages ago. It's at once easy to get lost, and easy to be mad at yourself for getting lost once you've regained your bearings. The urban areas of London and the iced earth are very humble compared to what's in Timeline 3. These maps are huge, and Smith's use of many distinct custom backgrounds for the far distance really contributes to the sense of solidity and the suspension of disbelief. Once you escape in a Nazi time shuttle, you find yourself on a space station in the far future, an AI collective that grew from the Black Mesa facility hundreds of years back. Freeman can still stop the Nazis, but only by destroying 4 of their time-stabilizing devices in 4 epochs of the past and distant future. This is where things really take off with the mod. There's a lot of science fiction games, but so much of it is of a certain type of easily graspable, easily gamified sci-fi. Space Marines and battlecruisers, bullet-riddled dystopias and giant battle mechs. Seldom do games try to depict settings that are truly alien to the point of being mystifyingly strange. Players need to relate to their environment, not be bamboozled by it, so the logic goes anyway. Timeline 3 is a game that spends a lot of time in the extreme distant future, which I think is one of the most underutilized settings in science fiction. My favorite of the genre is Charles Sheffield's 1997 novel Tomorrow and Tomorrow, where the main character ends up being frozen, cloned, and replicated from the year 2020 out so far in time that the heat death of the universe becomes a plot complication. There are many side stories throughout the novel of strange and hard-to-comprehend bits of the future, a subversion of the self-idolizing present, futures in which being from the past is a liability and a source of both pain and confusion. In the novel's most vivid chapter, the main character's mind has already been downloaded and preserved, so his cryotank is left to drift for millions of years. His tank is discovered, and he's revived by tiny aliens who watch in excited, forlorn confusion as he vomits blood and bile onto the floor of a pyramid in the distant reaches of space and time, and dies, hopelessly disconnected from everything he is and everything he wanted. The future is harsh and bizarre, and it is entirely possible to go way too far into it. Timeline 3 is the only mod, maybe even the only game, that I've seen take that baton and really run with it. It begins with a riff on H.G. Wells' original time machine novel. You walk into Wells' house in 19th century London, and there it is. So you get the whole sequence. Buildings rising and falling, the past becomes the future, and then the future falls away. In the year 800,000, your machine stops and you investigate the temples, sewers, and trams of what might be human civilization. It's hard to be sure. The only inhabitants now are the Nazis and the aliens, both interlopers like you, so you must be too late. But in a wonderful bit of foreshadowing, you also take 2 crystals from the display case of what seems to be a sort of museum. Then the floor falls out, and you must make your way through the technologically advanced but severely rusted out underbelly of the temples. After that, another time machine ride and a duplicate time machine hidden from you beneath the Sphinx. That machine takes you to the year 5 billion, where the bloated red sun dominates the sky. Everything is lava and ruins. The earth is dying. And you're still in the same place London was, made alien by the passage of eons. You also destroy a Nazi time stabilizer, billions of years beyond that, as the frozen ball of the Earth drifts between the stars, a few bizarre structures still dotting its surface. It's this scope, Smith's interest in the kind of extreme exoticism that games are capable of, but infrequently bother with, that makes this mod so appealing to me. And if you don't like that, you can also drive a Mad Max gasoline tanker. A lot of what's in Timeline is there because it's a mechanic in the root game. Like the tanker. Vehicles are a thing, although they can only move along a set path, and then you can jump on and off them while they're moving. So, tanker bomb. In making a mod, or another kind of visual, tangible fiction, you're always grappling with the limitations of your toolset. If you're shooting a movie, you have to hide the stage crew. If you're staging a play, you're limited to minimal sets and minimal locations. If you're making a Half-Life mod, anything you do with a story must also include gunfights and crouch jumping. So you've got all this amazing exotic science fiction going on, but what are you actually doing in the year 5 billion? You're killing Nazis with an assault rifle, and you're crouch jumping. The original Timeline mod tackled time travel in a more conventional way, and the Nazis seemed to fit right in. They felt tacked on to the end of Timeline 2, and in Timeline 3, they're a really awkward fit. The game's narrative ambition ran off ahead of their usefulness as villains. They're generic bad guys, who you fight in generic ways. You're doing that fighting in amazing places, for delightful reasons, but it's hard to escape the feeling that if Smith had more resources at his disposal, he could have been a lot more clever with it. The Nazis are like a programming shortcut. Smith chose to make the environments distinctive and sharp, and then filled those environments with enemies that are more or less from template. This is part of why I don't find review scores very meaningful. The perfect game is always an ideal to strive towards. Taking off points for falling short of an ideal seems foolish. For what it is, its epic scope and hundreds if not thousands of custom art assets to have been accomplished with such a small labor investment is astounding. There's plenty that, if you wanted to nitpick, could be nitpicked about Timeline. Timeline 3 is still no more a retail consumer product than Timeline 1, but it is a better game than the first mod in almost every way. And I find it even more enjoyable than many official follow-ups to Half-Life like Opposing Force and Blue Shift. Its level design is more meandering and hostile, its combat is harsher and heavier than the retail Half-Life experience, and its scope is weirder and wider too, though. Its presentation relies a lot more on figuring out what sorts of special effects the Gold Source engine is even capable of, than just those effects that look natural. A great example is the outpost beyond time and space. Eventually, the Nazis attack the space station you've been launching your attacks through time from, and to stop them for good, you must loop yourself out of the equation. No Black Mesa experiment, no time travel. So you time travel to the corridors under the anomalous experiments lab in 1998, trying to stop the resonance cascade that kicks off the campaign of the actual retail Half-Life experience. The G-Man tricks you. He's been working with his Nazi counterpart and strands you on an island beyond any timeline. If you jump off, you're put in any one of a half-dozen hopeless situations that kill you within seconds, like Pearl Harbor in 1945, Ypres, France during World War I, and the Vietnam jungle during the late 60s. It's Smith's riff on the hopeless choice the G-Man gives Gordon in the main game, but Gordon's got those crystal rods that he picked up in the year 800 and 2000, so, he's going to be just fine. When you get free, you fight your way through the Nazi version of Black Mesa in 2002, the very same facility you were in at the very start of the game. After killing your way from one end of the base to the other and back around again, you activate the time transporter, and instead of going to Black Mesa half an hour before the resonance cascade, you go 6 hours before. Once more through the base, once more in a mad dash to destroy the crystal that everyone who's played Half-Life would recognize in an instant as the source of everybody's trouble. In the first mod, the reuse of textures from the base game feels a little cheap. Here, after several hours of exploring settings that are powerfully unfamiliar, to wind up navigating parts of the Half-Life opening tram ride is a real nostalgic thrill. Not just looping the mod, but looping with the entire Half-Life journey. It's a profoundly satisfying way to engineer the conclusion, and the simplest way to make the Nazis stay in their home dimension and resolve the plot. The end sees Gordon riding the tram to the Sector C labs, but things are different this time. Barney is talking to an angry G-Man, and the experiments for the day have been cancelled. In a postscript text, Dr. Rosenberg, the scientist from Blue Shift, comments that Gordon could probably use a small token of acknowledgement and encouragement for being such good sport with things being so intolerably boring around Black Mesa lately. It's such a hilarious, low-key way to end the entire mod. Ultimately, this is one of the major reasons why I love Timeline so much. It's warm and human, tremendous in scope, but humble in presentation. I'm not sure why, even back in the day, Timeline never reached the heights of popularity that other single-player mods did. Is it because of the many eccentricities and idiosyncrasies, because the mods begin amateurishly and don't reveal the depth of their complexity until deeper into the experience? Or is it because the mods are too sprawling, sacrificing efficiency in level design for variety in level design? Let's look next at two mods that are as compact and tight as Timeline is expansive and eccentric. Poke 646, or maybe Poka 646, is an abysmally awkward name for a pair of the most technically and mechanically well-considered single-player mods ever released for the original Half-Life. They fill an important gap in the Half-Life universe. What happened exactly between the two main games anyway? The Earth is invaded and civilization falls, but that's all in the past for Half-Life 2. Poke 646 is an urban maze through Nation City, an industrial American metropolis under siege from Zen. You're Damian Reeves, another postgraduate schlub who goes from assistant to interdimensional action hero in the course of hours. Poke focuses even more on Reeves' civilian status than Half-Life does with Freeman, though, and it suits the level design quite well. You've got a pipe instead of a crowbar, and you get tired if you swing it around too much. You've got nail guns instead of pistols and an assault rifle. There's a strange gun creature from Zen, wristwatch explosives courtesy of your government employer, a sniper bow. Really, the most traditional weapon is a shotgun. It's a hell of a shotgun, though. It actually knocks you back when you use it, and the spread is powerfully wide. It's one of the heftiest, most satisfying shotguns in any game, an obvious grandchild of Doom 2's double barrel, and it's unusual to find such a well-designed custom weapon outside of the professional releases. Especially in a Half-Life mod, which already has a shotgun with a very different kind of feel to it, speedier, more tactical. Poke's combat, like many mods, is geared towards a higher difficulty than the main game, yet it never feels completely unfair, and part of that is how compact it is. Timeline's ammunition and health scarcity was especially hard to overcome because you went so far through so many levels before you could fully restock. Here, each level is a discrete urban puzzle, and your mistakes in combat are less cumulative as a result. The combat, while excellent in its pacing and balance, is secondary to the environment. The puzzles and mazes are given even more attention than the bullets and blood, and your greatest enemy is waist-high barriers. If there's one thing truly janky and outdated about the first Half-Life, it is surely crouch jumping. So often I'll think I don't understand a puzzle solution when it turns out I'm just not hitting those two keys in the exact right order at the exact right time. It's a complaint I have for all the mods, but some are worse than others about the crouch jump situation. The way you navigate the maze of the city in this mod is wildly dependent on the mechanic. It's the quality of these mazes that make the mod so damn memorable, though. The story is mostly tangential outside of its placement in the Half-Life order of events. Damian Reeves in the Poke 646 organization is just a vague theme the game uses, mostly to indicate rest stops. Anytime you see the white Econoline vans with the Poke 646 logo, you know you're about to get a solid restock in a few moments quiet. What's remarkable is the fidelity of the urban environment. All the textures are a little sharper and a little more impressive than the average mod, and the custom weapons and animations designed with more care and detail. The monster gallery, the plot, the stakes of interdimensional invasion with bloodthirsty military goons thrown in for good measure, that's all standard, boilerplate Half-Life. Yet Poke 646 feels mechanically distinctive from the base game, and I think that's a real accomplishment, since it's a thematic and narrative sequel. Half-Life 2's City 17 was a landmark achievement in first-person world-building, but it was a very long way from New Mexico. Poke 646 fits into the gap between the two games not only in plot, but in environmental design. It tackles the same redirect as the main games, from indoor hallways and laboratories to outdoor streets and rooftops, but with a deliberately generically American flavor. I mean, the local newspaper office has plaques for L. Lane and C. Kent, for God's sake. As an amateur production, by a team of a half dozen instead of one, the Poke 646 team is afforded the chance to do whatever they please, but they keep the jokes in the background and the foreground airtight. From hotel rooms to bar rooms to warehouses to libraries with underground bunkers, the mod really does run the whole spectrum. There are numerous instances of really pushing the gold source to do its absolute most, from gloss on the library floor to a higher resolution of textures than the base game, which provides a neat kind of thrill, not because the effects are so impressive by modern standards, but because the mod team demonstrates a slightly defter hand with gold source effects than even Valve. Of course, they also had longer to tinker. This mod didn't come out until 2005. After a trip mine puzzle for a lead into the climax, you use a portal hidden in a bathroom stall to go to Zen and shut down the source of the invasion. You jump past a giant robot and a laser fence, and you turn off the generator, and then you strand yourself in an alien dimension. That's the end. An excellent end, all things considered. Tidy. In 2006, the Poke 646 team released Vendetta, a follow-up. It's shorter, it's more combat-oriented, and it's more focused on what the team can do with Gold Source Engine's effects than the game's level design. Unlike Timeline, it's actually a bit of a step backwards in many ways for its climax, all of which have to do with the mod's strange nostalgia for itself. A number of user reviews I've seen say Vendetta is the best Half-Life mod out there, and this is true in one critical arena. I've never seen any other Gold Source game, amateur or professional, look quite as sharp using this engine. This was the Poke 646 team's real interest in Vendetta. It's a mod that's more explorative for the designers than the players, ultimately, giving players a linear tour through the long list of impressive and attractive custom features that the team has made. There's 3 parts. The first has Damian Reeves using a shuttle that was already present in the climax of the original mod to head to a secret government facility on the Zen side. Source was obviously a profound improvement over Gold Source, and while Vendetta certainly doesn't come close to looking like a Source mod, it certainly does look like an early 2000s shooter and not a late 90s one. Honestly, if I came across it as a budget retail product, I wouldn't ever suspect that it had technology from 1998 running it. And before, really, considering Half-Life's guts are built on top of Quake technology. It's an impressive series of sci-fi facility corridors. But that's the thing, it's kinda generic. The lead-in is a poorly written setup about Damian Reeves' impending vengeance, a this time it's personal kind of deal. With the first poke, there's a lot that feels well thought out, particularly with how the game falls between Half-Life 1 and 2, both narratively and environmentally. With Vendetta, it feels more like, well, we need to sequence these levels, so let's figure out how to do that real quick. The second part of the mod is all about returning to Nation City, and returning is all you do. You actually retread through the vast majority of areas you've already gone through in the last mod, in very rapid backwards order. It's a charismatic backtrack with a lot of new shortcuts and redirects, but the second part is actually roughly half the mod, so half the mod is mostly the previous mod with fewer puzzles. Instead of nail guns, you've got a proper assault rifle this time. The gameplay, the plot, the pace and structure of the levels, instead of improving with time, they've all become more conventional and more generic. The only thing that's improved is the visual fidelity. Is that enough to make it one of the best mods for Half-Life, to be the best looking and not much else? With Timeline 3, the climax unexpectedly tied the mod to the base game and made them a continuous whole. With Poke 646, the original, you feel like you're playing an unofficial bridge between the official releases. Vendetta feels like a tech demo for an engine that's receding into the past faster and faster. What makes a good Half-Life mod isn't just technical ambition. What the first Poke 646 showed is that what matters first is creativity and perspective, and if you can back it up with clever visuals, more's the better. It was a good Half-Life mod because of how it reinterpreted all the elements of Half-Life gameplay, not just the textures and not just the lighting. Let's look at another unofficial sequel now, a much more freewheeling one for which creativity and perspective are the glue holding it together. In Half-Life 2, the electricity-wielding Vortigaunts were friends of Freeman, grateful for him having liberated them from the Nihilith. In Half-Life 1, they're just enemies, one of the most ubiquitous enemies across all the mods and all the games. Point of View is an extremely long, dense adventure from DAV levels that ditches guns, health, and the HEV suit entirely to put you in the perspective of a special Vortigaunt named Zonst. Not only is the fundamental perspective different, but all the rhythms of combat are different as well. Your electric attack also heals you, so your health depends less on whether you play offensively or defensively, so long as you just don't miss. Unfortunately, it makes the combat a lot less dynamic as a result. You have some other weapons, like the Hive Hand and Snarks, but primarily you're relying on your electric attack for the whole mod, and all enemies take about 2 direct hits unless you get a headshot. Hard to do, since instead of crosshairs, you have to estimate a point in between your claws and your little thorax arm thing. Once you get the hang of it, it's a fun and visceral attack, but there's still no escaping the fact that the rhythm is still too slow and too predictable. You charge, you zap, you charge, you zap, and then the soldier falls over, and then you do that for all the soldiers in the room, and then you move on to the next room. It's ponderous. Dav is a sincere devotee of the abstract labyrinth shooter games of yesteryear like Doom as well, and Point of View includes a huge range of mazes that serve no architectural or thematic purpose other than to get a player disoriented and turned around, presumably so that the aha moment of finally finding the exit is more satisfying. The electric attack is the only one that heals you, and you're incredibly fragile, so you have to use it constantly, and clearing a room with it becomes boring and deliberate so quickly. Combine this with all the wasted space and needlessly sprawling levels that Dav is fond of, and you've got a great idea that wears out its welcome early but continues to hang around. Dav is also behind a very well-regarded mod called Azur's Sheep, a pre-Blue Shift that speculates on Barney's experiences during the Black Mesa incident. I could never get into Azur's Sheep because of Dav's level design specifically. He has a lot of good ideas for themes, and he's got a deft hand with the engine, but there's a feeling of levels being twice as large as they need to be that runs throughout both mods. Mods that use Black Mesa as a backdrop are by far the most common variety, since they require the least custom resources. Dav's no slacker, though. He's notable for having a distinctive, anything-goes approach to his mods. He brings in the pulse rifle from Aliens. He made HEV suit versions of all the usual suspects, the scientists, soldiers, security guards. Mechanically and architecturally, though, they're very noticeably amateur mods. That doesn't detract from how memorable and quirky the production is as a whole, though. Dav tries to turn Zonst, your Vortigaunt, into a relatable character by bolting on a journal to the game. Over the course of the 5 or 6 hours it takes to get through the mod, you'll find 40 journal entries that both explain what's going on in front of you, since there's no real voice acting, and explain what's going on for Zonst as a rational being. If you don't read the journals, you'll miss it entirely, but Point of View does tell a likable, warm story of a creature who's used to serving, becoming courageous, curious, and eventually defiant towards the ambitions of the Nihilant and the G-Man both. Point of View takes a few hours to move out of Zen. Instead of the tenuous foothold in the border world that the humans have in the base game, Point of View has sprawling human facilities dotting the surface of Zen. There's even a big armed cargo train running through it, which is not that great, honestly. Zen becomes less exotic, less interesting. But once you find the human portal to their homeworld, Black Mesa takes on a fresh unfamiliarity, and that's what's special about Point of View. Its primary intention, make the player see Black Mesa through a fresh set of eyes at a whole new angle, is accomplished with real skill. I have a lot of structural problems with Point of View, but very few tonal ones. You feel like a Vortigaunt, from the claws of your feet to the extra sets of eyeballs on your head. Another real delight of the mod is witnessing a few key Half-Life moments from an alternate perspective. Remember the Osprey crash at the beginning of Opposing Force? You're the Vortigaunt that kills Shepard's buddy. It happens very quickly, just enough time to recognize the map before the crash occurs, and then that guy comes out shooting, and zap! You've participated in an iconic Half-Life moment. It's wonderful. The parts of the Half-Life modding scene I find most compelling are the ones that creatively rearrange the elements of Half-Life iconography and design. Point of View is a real classic of Black Mesa-focused modding. Yet many of the most famous mods leave Black Mesa far behind, aiming for experiences completely outside Valve's original vision. They Hunger was one of the highest-profile, most fondly remembered mods made for Half-Life, the product of Neil Menke's Black Widow game studio working on behalf of PC Gamer magazine. They Hunger is a zombie mod, but from back from before there was such an oversaturation of zombies. Long before Left 4 Dead, They Hunger fused Valve shooter game rhythms with classic zombie tropes. Left 4 Dead mimicked the modern zombie movie, fast zombies, big explosions, constant action. It was the Zack Snyder Dawn of the Dead aesthetic. They Hunger is George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, in more ways than just slow zombies and a shoestring budget. When you think back on Romero originals, the black and white Night of the Living Dead particularly, they're memorable not for how scary the zombies are or how well the cast builds tension, because the movie is terrible at both of those things, but for how outrageously, likably weird the production is. The acting is stiff and bizarre, from the opening, "They're coming for you, Barbara," to the sullen and incredibly casual assault of the zombie horde's final attack on the farmhouse. The effects they use are incredibly minimal. They torch an old truck, they nail some boards down, and then the zombies feast on meat that hasn't been gone too long from the supermarket. It's not so much that the movie is trying to make the threat of the zombies vivid and real like recent zombie media. It's self-consciously telling a story, with too long speeches from bad actors made worse by the pacing of a stage play, essentially a half-dozen characters stuck in a single location. They Hunger mimics the feel of Romero's early films perfectly, the lethargy punctuated by jagged over-enthusiasm in the way characters deliver dialogue, the prioritization of mood over realism, the rural mid-60s aesthetic, but by virtue of being a game and not a movie, it's not so limited in its environmental presentation. They Hunger is a tribute to the old zombie movies, but it's also a major expansion on them. Each with the 3 mods takes at least a couple of hours to beat, and in Half-Life tradition, all 3 represent an unbroken, one foot in front of the other journey from the evening of the zombie apocalypse all the way through to days later, where the army of the dead is preparing to march against the rest of humanity. There's no cutscenes and no limitations of environment, besides those posed by working with the Gold Source engine. Outdoor environments are obviously just corridors with earth tones, outdoor doors, but even if the effect is cheap, as far as mods go, it was very novel. The Hunger 1 came out in 1999. The way it swapped the urban industrial mazes for outdoor rural ones is damn distinctive, and the kind of smoke and mirrors funhouse tricks that Menke uses to make the spaces feel bigger than they are turn out to be surprisingly effective, not so much suspending the player's disbelief as actively playing cat and mouse with it. The thing that's so wonderful about the first They Hunger is its pacing. From a car crash on the outskirts of town, you first encounter the zombies in a church, then a graveyard, then there's a long outdoor trek through the swamps. The swamps might be a little irritating. Gold Source is, like I said, really terrible at natural environments. Half-Life got a few good vistas out of it, but when you think back on the naturally scenic moments in Half-Life, like the cliffside where you come out the pipe and the jet zooms by, The actual design of the level is just a big backdrop and a few twisty corridors, using the cliff as the other side of the wall. Even Valve can't escape falling back on outdoor doors. They Hunger 1 has a good sense of rhythm between when to constrict and when to open up in the environment, though, and a good rhythm helps obscure the flaws. Devil's Rift, a big volcanic sinkhole, is a great example of a rhythmic environment. It's hard to get a good variety of outdoor spaces with Gold Source's particular aesthetic. Mankey has a skill with using elevation and underground to break up the environment into more interesting areas and more distinct chunks. As you move towards the town, you encounter an abandoned police car and then later zombie cops who are quick on the draw for the undead. You drive a train, you investigate a hydroelectric jam, and finally you crawl in the window of a barn on the backside of town. You're trying to find help, but it's already too late. The radio station the game opened with, and whose broadcast you'd been listening to throughout the game, is empty, unless you check the closet where the DJ is being eaten. You drive a police car through a barricade and into a gas station. You have a tense rooftop-to-rooftop gunfight with zombified police. As fun as the rural maps are, they're mostly just novel for Half-Life mods. These urban in-town spaces are what Gold Source was really designed for, so the game plays harder, faster, and more satisfying in these last bits, which feels appropriately climactic. For a mod, the pacing is pitch perfect, and for a zombie game, it still stands out among more professional titles. The variety is staggering and the mood is underexplored. Not the hyper-realism of a modern zombie game like Dying Light, but the kind of everybody knows we're just extras in makeup, but there's still a big horde of us coming through the windows classic zombie horror aesthetic, with bonus period-appropriate props and background design. It even ends on the same kind of dire, hopeless note. Instead of being shot, you're captured by the zombie sheriff when you reach the top floor of the police station, and are about to be eaten yourself at the opening of Part 2. When I was younger, I thought the second They Hunger was the weakest of them. I honestly have no idea how I ever got that impression, though. There are things that are interesting and successful about both the preceding and the upcoming mods, but They Hunger 2 is something of a perfect B-movie experience in microcosm. The thing that I think may have soured my younger self is the fact that They Hunger 2 is much more of a labyrinth than the others, both of which are focused on a long, linear journey. Here, there's the short journey to the insane asylum, but the journey is primarily a sewer maze. If I had one frivolous but all-powerful wish, I would wish for a universal moratorium on sewer mazes. Even modern shooters won't let them die, and no matter the game, the experience is always nearly identical. Yes, it's one of the few modes of human architecture that genuinely does consist of a confusing network of dark tunnels, but can't we all agree that the sewer maze is the least creative, most depressingly ubiquitous level design cliché in the book? There's a ton of them just in the mods I cover in this video, and I hate them all. But again, it's so ubiquitous a fallback idea that complaint seems almost pointless. Being surprised at a sewer level in a shooter is like being surprised that rain falls from the sky. Maybe you'll get lucky and it won't be today, but it's an inescapable phenomenon. The one here in They Hunger 2 is a bit of a mean-spirited one in design to boot, with a lot of looping red herring paths and unclear, sometimes time-sensitive means of progression through barriers. The thing is, right before the sewers is a slum level in a run-down industrial part of town, and the feeling of fun and exploration runs much more strongly in that brief level. Why not use that as the setting for the maze? It's not that an industrial slum is any less cliché, but as an environment where people actually lived, it's more effective for selling the creepiness and horror of the zombies. Of course, They Hunger's sound design does a lot of that work, too. Like Doom before it, a big part of Half-Life sound design was hearing enemies off in the distance as they growled and plotted against you. In They Hunger, it's the same, but instead of recon, you get the plaintive, delightfully unsettling, why do we hunger? And many more. After a while, a few can get pretty repetitive, but overall the voice acting helps sustain the atmosphere of dread. Like the original Night of the Living Dead, it's not the believability of the dialogue that counts, it's the cumulative creepiness that results from its consistently off-kilter tone and delivery. So the sewer level relies a lot on the feeling of the tunnels being full of dangers just out of sight, which it does accomplish. I'm just weary of the trope. Once you exit the sewers, you find yourself outside the nexus of all the trouble, Dr. Franklin's asylum for the criminally insane. Although the outdoor environments absolutely distinguish They Hunger from other mods, they're pretty obviously the weak point in the design. They Hunger 2, with its roughly 1/3 sewers, 2/3 insane asylum level distribution, plays much more to the intrinsic strengths of the Gold Source engine, the indoor facility and the winding corridor. What's more is that the switch, from trying to find out what's going on to being trapped in the beating black heart of what's going on, is a fantastic way to deepen the horror and the player investment without breaking the balance between self-conscious B-horror in the audio-visual design and earnest survival horror tension in the mechanics. In this episode of the mod, there are audio logs played off reel-to-reel recorders, which are really well done for a C-Studio release like They Hunger. Mankey and Black Widow games know the exact tone of schlock horror that made George Romero's early films cult classics, which they blend with other films by reaching even further back in horror film history and throwing in Frankenstein themes and enemies. What's funny about the new enemies, like the electric skeletons who you first discover in the asylum morgue and the Frankenstein fellas that the zombified doctor in charge unleashes on you, is that although they fit the setting perfectly fine, they are quite obviously reskins of other Half-Life enemies. Barnacles, head crabs, and the sea monster had already shown up in the first They Hunger, but the hound eyes became actual hounds here in the second, the armored alien grunts became melee-only Frankensteins, and the Vortigaunts got a new bone-clattering sound effect to go with their new look as skeletons. I wish there had been a little more restraint in using reskins instead of wholly new enemies, because the effect makes They Hunger 2 feel, especially within the concrete parts of the asylum, maybe a little too like the base game. But the flavor of the asylum is still the kind of playful, gleeful gore of the first mod. There are torture chambers in the physical therapy wing, living heads trapped in jars, disembodied hands that act like head crabs. Well, maybe the last one isn't so fun. You could take head crabs and head crab equivalents out of every single They Hunger, and I wouldn't miss them, with one exception in the next mod. But since the hands do just as much damage as regular head crabs and are half the size and seemingly twice the hit points, it makes them a hugely frustrating and really awful enemy. Still, a small complaint in the scheme of it. The delight of navigating the asylum overwhelms the minor issues. Unlike many amateur mazes, the solutions never feel arbitrary. The asylum makes architectural sense as a building, and you'll find yourself bouncing from wing to wing in an unexpected order. Seeing these architectural connections coming back around on the rear side of that one mysterious locked door that caught your eye an hour ago is such a unique satisfaction of first-person games, and They Hunger 2 excels at providing it. Another highly unusual feature of the mod is an actual far-ranging consequence for an environmental puzzle. In the last quarter of the mod, you're trapped in a basement, and your only way out is to overload the boiler, knocking a door down with the explosion. Pretty standard puzzle, right? Well, it sets the asylum on fire, and for the entire rest of the mod, you're having to deal with outrunning the flames as they consume parts of your path, forcing you to take detours and requiring quick thinking. The ending of this mod is pretty bleak as well. You never truly escape the asylum, you become trapped again and ignite a gasoline reserve in desperation. The resulting blast knocks you out, and with a fade to white, mod ends. It's a nice contrast to all those boss fights and so many of the other mods. They Hunger 3 fumbles where I felt Timeline 3 really succeeded, in uniting the strengths of previous mods while streamlining the weaknesses of them. They Hunger 3 instead exacerbates its own weaknesses in what ends up being a case of misdirected ambition. They Hunger 3 has a few individual moments that are really phenomenal, but overall, I felt like this was the weakest of the trilogy in many ways. It starts very strongly, though, so that isn't immediately obvious. The hospital where you wake up is a solid slow burner of an introduction, where it isn't clear if the zombies actually happened or not. All you hear is the crying of a baby in the distance. Following the sound, you arrive at a newborn viewing station. The nurse comes when you hit the call button, but when she sees you, she turns around to reveal jagged gashes running down her back. Zombies. Nothing but zombies. As you find a radio in the hospital, instead of the live updates on the disaster you heard on receivers throughout the first mod, it's a zombie broadcast, screaming about the end of the living with the crazed fervor of an AM radio preacher, another George Romero signature sound. So escaping the town is the plan. The hospital is a well-paced, well-structured set of levels. It's also an infuriatingly common level design trope, but They Hunger 3 does such a good job with its hospital that it stays engaging despite the thematic familiarity. Where it falters is by going back to the swamps. I like the idea of these large outdoor areas, but the outdoor doors aren't properly broken up with enough open areas like they used to be. Instead, you have entire mazes of nothing but outdoor doors, twice as long as the swamps in They Hunger 1, filled with killer bulls. The brevity and variety of outdoor environments in the earlier titles was well considered. The player never truly slowed down enough to unravel the tension through cheapness. Not so with these outdoor mazes. They force the player to pay very specific attention to the environment, and the environment is overwhelmingly cheap and boring. What's worse is that there's a 45-minute backtrack across the entire journey from the barn where you first meet the zombie bulls to the asylum. Like Vendetta, They Hunger 3 is a mod that can't help but be nostalgic for itself. You replay highlights of the asylum level after the fire is raged through, and although it's kind of cool to retread across your destructive handiwork, it's still a massive chunk of the mod dedicated to backtracking maps you played in the last mod, on top of backtracking maps that you play in this mod. Although They Hunger is the longest of the three, it's got the least amount of what feels like genuinely new and engaging content. They Hunger 3 wants to be a capital letter climax. It wants to tap into the vibe of bigger, better, more video game sequels. So it has more guns, more enemies, more action, more dialogue, longer length. It's too much. They Hunger 3 shatters the kind of low-budget aesthetic of the previous ones, which are reliant on using only what you minimally need to tell the story. Throwing in the kitchen sink, from a design perspective, does the mod no favors. Here's an example of the mod getting it right in the small details, though. Having driven cars in the game in the past, when you see a rusted truck on the outskirts of a farm, you have to wonder whether it'll work or not. When you've killed the zombies nearby, you can climb on up in it, and then bring up the little throttle indicator. But you just can't get the engine to turn over. Pushing the little throttle makes the truck fruitlessly chug the starter and nothing else. By subverting the player's gameplay expectations by letting you bring up the menu in the first place, the mod mimics the frustration of a motor that won't fire in a really tangible way. It's a small detail, but it's a small detail that puts you right inside of a classic movie moment, casually and brilliantly. Another small detail, mostly replacing the zombie headcrabs with zombie roosters. They're just as mechanically annoying, but their hilariously bloodthirsty clucking makes them a real joy as an enemy. They replace an enemy that doesn't fit in, the headcrab replacement, with one that does, in a way that just amplifies the B-movie feel. It's only the game's own need to top itself that causes problems. Like the talking zombies. The talking zombies never made 100% sense. There's no real rules for which zombies have an agenda, and which ones are just wandering around looking for the brain buffet. But the plot has to have more complications, so how about zombie revolution? There's a general impression that the zombies are organizing, getting smarter, but that runs really counter to the spirit of zombies, the idea of the flesh and spirit being reduced to endless raw hunger. If they're putting together human dismantling assembly lines, I mean, that's fun for B-movie schlock, but it's so fundamentally silly that investment in the world starts to unravel a bit. This is really exacerbated by the game's two one right after the other boss fights, one versus Dr. Franklin, who now has a giant cyborg body and a cannon for a hand, and one versus the sheriff in a climactic helicopter versus helicopter showdown. Both fights are cramped, you're stuck inside a helicopter for both. Franklin takes between 8 and 20 sniper headshots, or the equivalent to take down, depending on difficulty, a true bullet sponge, and you better be miserly with your ammunition too, because the next boss fight can see you in a hopeless situation where you run completely out of ammunition and have to restart from the last autosave, which is before the start of the first boss battle with Franklin. If you don't run out of bullets, you might run out of patience. The Hunger 3 aimed for more, but ended up with less. Still, even if the game's climax is terrible from a gameplay's perspective, there's still one last trick up its sleeve. Years before Jonathan Coulton wrote Still Alive for the Portal credits, They Hunger had You Are What I Eat, a zombie-themed country ditty that accompanies the credit roll. It melts the frustration like butter on a stovetop. Okay, bad boss fight. But the game is right. A good time was definitely had by all. They Hunger could get away with the great outdoors because it was in the woods at night. You could slim the path down to a deceptively narrow route and still hold the player's investment in the setting. Wanted, the Western mod for Half-Life, is absolutely, completely doomed from the start. The defining feature of every Western, in print, on film, in games, is the open country of the American West. Wide open spaces as far as the eye can see. This is something that the Gold Source engine is literally incapable of doing on a technical level, and where almost every other mod plays to the engine's strengths, Maverick Studios must, by mandate of a genre, grapple with the engine's most crippling weakness. The result is the most boring video game Western I've ever played, and I've played Gun twice. I do respect the ambition, and Maverick Studios obviously poured a lot of man-hours into it, but it's a barren, abrasive experience. Hit detection is poor, the combat rhythms of Gold Source aren't suited to 6-shooters and slow weapons, and the models, good lord the enemy models. Some of them look generic, some of them look hopelessly goofy, prospectors especially. It's difficult to describe, but they move more like upright hamsters with beards than people. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to take it as a player. Is it deliberately comedic? The mod is very self-serious otherwise. Is it incompetence? There are moments, rare moments, where the Western experience does trickle through in meaningful ways. Did they really design the whole game thinking that the prospectors were good enough as they were? It's mysterious. And it's broken, to boot. I couldn't find a version that wouldn't crash maybe a third of the way through, with some other strange bugs on top of it. Like when you receive in-game letters, but what actually comes up is a class selection screen from Team Fortress Classic. As hilarious it is to consider a letter reading, Dearest Rogan, enclosed is an important list of differences in grenade loadouts. It does suck not to have any idea how the plot is advancing. All you get is endless brown geometry filled with ornery 3D wildlife. Truly, the majesty of the West. Wanted never appears on best of Half-Life mod lists, and for good reason, considering that it's broken, brown, and boring. But it's an interesting attempt at a rare game genre that illustrates how the technology you use to make a game really impacts what you're thematically able to do with it. You can't just do any random thing you come up with. Can you? I think Heart of Evil is one of the most improbable, bizarre game experiences I've ever had. It's a parody of Resident Evil-style survival horror in the form of a light remake of Apocalypse Now, with a whole heap of cheap, sophomoric jokes thrown in on top of it for good measure. It is, at once, a genuinely impressive feat of level design and a deliberately antagonistic flop in the gameplay department. The entire mod is more or less an escort mission. Yes, an escort mission, across dozens of maps, with extremely complicated scavenger hunt puzzles. As Corporal Percy Freeman, you must venture deeper and deeper into the Vietnam jungle in search of Colonel Bob Kurtz. And you've got to take Barney with you. Barney and a plate of roast moose. There's some dumb jokes involving racist accents that I might cut, but at its core, each unlikable thing about Heart of Evil is unlikable as a send-up and celebration of overcomplicated puzzles and obnoxious game design in professional horror releases. Heart of Evil is a serious game the way Spinal Tap is a serious band. Their inadequacies are a major part of the performance and a major part of the fun. It pokes fun at adventure games and their habit of making you pick up seemingly random items that turn out to be critically valuable hours and hours down the line, like the roast moose. You're invited to take it during the mission briefing, but you won't use it until maybe 4 hours later when, in a blood-stained jail, use it to distract zombies away from the keys to the cells. Unreliable NPCs get their jokes as well. Why'd you tell the bad guys everything, Barney? I had to, sir. He said he wouldn't be my friend anymore, is Barney's actual in-game explanation, verbatim. And there's not a gamer on Earth who actually enjoys escort missions, so making it the central linchpin mechanic of the whole mod is what amounts to trolling on the part of the Heart of Evil team. Barney sucks. You need him for everything. Looks like this time's the joke's on you, right? If this was a professional release, this would be an insult. Someone got paid to be a dick to their customers. Well, Heart of Evil is not a professional release. No one got paid. The joke isn't ultimately at the player's expense. It's a shared joke between modder and player alike. A shared indulgence in a mechanic that everyone knows is crap, but understand how to navigate and manage anyway because of love of the medium. The only thing that really sucks is that pathfinding code can get destroyed as Half-Life creeps up in version number. I got to a point where Barney was hopelessly, irrevocably stuck in the same place in 2 separate playthroughs. Like Wanted, the original Heart of Evil as it was released in 2002 was in danger of being lost to time and update creep. So I just went ahead and switched to the 2007 remake of Heart of Evil. The Napalm edition of Heart of Evil is made by a totally different team than the first. They're fans who wanted the game to persist unbroken and with sharper textures into the future. At this, they succeeded. They also added some other stuff, like an anime girl and even more racism, but if you can overlook the teenage basement undercurrent running through it, the levels and moods of the mod are still completely unique and generally worthwhile for gaming obsessives. Heart of Evil is very much a series of inside jokes for gamers in its mechanical and structural design. The folks doing voice acting for the Napalm edition are awful comedians, though, and the jokes that aren't mechanical fall flat more often than they did even in the original version of Heart of Evil. Still, Napalm edition of Heart of Evil is a remarkable devotional act from one team of modders to another. The graphical update is genuinely impressive. It looks very much part of the Gearbox era of Half-Life, not the original which wore its Quake roots on its sleeve. But not everything they updated turned out for the best. Beside the extra serving of low-effort jokes, Napalm Edition also has an awful feel to the weapons. They feel floaty and weak, bad sound effects, terrible spreads. The shotgun here in Napalm Edition is the worst out of all the mods I've played. It feels like one of those 99-cent confetti poppers you used to find in the grocery store checkout counter. They also rebalanced the zombies. It used to be, in the first, that zombies had to be dismantled into gibs so they wouldn't stay shot and on the ground. They'd just get back up again. You could use explosives, but you could also use any other weapon if you wasted enough ammo with it. In Napalm Edition, only explosives and the M60 can harm zombies. It's better this way. Your regular arsenal is good against live opponents and buying time to run past a zombie while it's on the ground. In fact, making the zombies so close to indestructible makes them more obstacle than enemy. It takes you out of the clear room, move on, repeat mindset. The levels in Heart of Evil are done as sets, with scavenger hunt puzzles barring progression to the exit, which is always a vehicle that you need Barney to pilot. If you try to exit the level without him, the game tells you via low-key message that you are too stupid to drive the truck or fly the plane, so you'll have to find someone less dense. It's a little strange to have a fun time being trolled, but that's the experience. The levels are clever enough and the design is well considered enough that it's obvious that these dozens of bullshit inconveniences are entirely deliberate. The uniquely weird mashup of Apocalypse Now, zombies, and airplane-styled gags that flesh out the skeleton of trollish mechanical design just makes it all the more interesting, all the more unlikely as a game experience. It's weird, but in a joking way. When mods go out of their way to get weird in a serious way, though, the results can drift even farther out from the shore of classic Half-Life design. I didn't finish Afraid of Monsters because I ultimately think that the design is too hostile and too confusing. For many players, that's complimentary, though. Afraid of Monsters and its more professional companion piece, Cry of Fear, are horror games that deal in delusion. At the open of Afraid of Monsters, your character must take pills in the bathroom of a rundown hospital. When he goes then into one of the bathroom stalls, the world falls out underneath him. You're thrust into a remarkably artistic world of delusion, where you're meant to follow the dots and trust in the path under your feet. It's wonderfully nerve-wracking and extremely creepy. I've never really seen anything else done in this particular style, aiming for this particular tone of oppressive delusion. At least not with the Gold Source engine. After that, though, it switches over to a more identifiably Half-Life experience. You're back in the hospital, but there's monsters and puzzles everywhere now. Like Heart of Evil, it takes a lot of cues from Resident Evil with its bizarre color-coded puzzles unraveling the layers of the level one after another with excruciating slowness. It's also a survival horror mod that generally expects you to run from monsters. There's never enough ammo, and it's right there in the title. But the Gold Source's weird quirks keep that from working out very well. Your feeble cone of a flashlight makes it so that only a tiny window of your screen is really usable in a meaningful way, which, when coupled with some of the most outrageous puzzle box level design characteristics in any of these mods, it makes navigation more aggravating than tense 9 times out of 10. You get lost, then you die. That's the game. Most of the enemies are taken straight from the main game, like bull squids, head crabs, and zombies, but given more severe, gory reskins. It's great to behold, interesting in principle, but I found the execution of ideas to be kind of aggravating for the most part. Is it deliberate? I want to look next at a mod which takes the dark surrealism of Afraid of Monsters, the deliberate game design trolling of Heart of Evil, and the classic iconography of Half-Life, and then throws them all together in a nihilistic blender. Halfquake by the modder Muttersheep is simple in premise. You have done something wrong in your life, and now you're going to be punished for it. Forever. The entire trilogy of mods is a deadly maze of puzzles, not entirely unlike Portal. Maybe an amateur grimdark Portal without the titular mechanic, but there's still many compelling similarities in intent and execution. They're both based on the premise of a long death maze, with pain being the consequence for failure and homicidal puzzles as a reward for success. Neither take themselves seriously about it either, even though they revolve around very dark themes. The danger and darkness is a conscious illusion in these titles. You're meant to die over and over. There is no expectation of taking the consequence of death seriously for the player. So have a heaping helping of death, with a side of mangling. Portal is bright and comedic in tone, despite being a dark comedy in terms of danger. GLaDOS is a sparkling conversationalist. Halfquake, though, is dark, nihilistic, and full of a kind of teenage ennui, which, as Errant Signal once pointed out, is Quake's signature vibe. Halfquake, on top of everything it's doing as a puzzler, is also returning the engine to the aesthetics of its technical root. It's interestingly positioned as a game between the past and the future, between Quake and Portal. More so than Portal, Halfquake relies on fostering, above all else, a sense of competitiveness in the player. These puzzles are deliberately unfair, overlarge, and too complicated for a retail game. Halfquake is relying on the player's instinct to roll up their sleeves, put a cigarette behind their ear, and say, "Oh yeah, tough guy? Well, have you know I've crouch-jumped before." And then the game says, "Sure you have, but not while the floor is rotating underneath you," and back and forth like that for puzzle after puzzle. It's a hard-to-create dynamic, and quite unique to these sorts of one-man show productions. You're not trying to get the high score, you're trying to quite literally beat the developer at his own game. Beating Halfquake is like getting that 1 point on the scoreboard in Desert Bus. It's frivolous, deliberately annoying, and hard to accomplish, so it feels like a goddamn big accomplishment to have bothered with it at all, right? Well, out of all the ideas that Halfquake likes being playful with, the idea that the player's actions have meaning and value is the most malleable of them. So you get things like a side-scrolling portion. Side-scrolling in Half-Life, isn't that awkward? It is incredibly awkward and extremely frustrating, but you push yourself to do it out of curiosity if it can be done. Someone designed it to be beaten, it must have a way, and it does. But the climax is your character getting a rusty spike to the brain pan while the test proctors laugh at you. Sure did win that game, didn't you? The two follow-ups to Halfquake, Amen and Sunrise, double down on everything unique about Halfquake in fascinating ways. The most interesting is Muttersheep's decision to totally abandon a conventional color palette and architectural sense. The plot is the same. You are a glutton for punishment and the game is a buffet table. The structure of the game is far more surreal and freeform, though. The movie Cube, one of the major inspirations for the mod, throws in a number of suggestions that the cube doesn't operate strictly within the realm of physics and reality. It has a savage internal logic that all within must decipher or perish, but there's a sense that the cube will do what the cube will do, sense be damned. Is it hell? Or is there a more conventional explanation? In Amen and Sunrise, Mudasheep takes that a step farther by incorporating the underlying philosophy of disdain for the player into environmental puzzles. Here's one where you have to spell out sadism in a crossword. There's one that kills you if you say life has no meaning as a yes or no response. There's a puzzle that requires you to literally wait 20 minutes and then you're just free to move to the next room. Interestingly, when you hit the exit key, a message comes up asking if you really want to escape this place. The implication is clear. You're not in these terrible places of death, torture, and game design pranks because you're genuinely trying to escape. You're here because you want to be. If you really wanted to escape, you just exit the game. There. You're free. You're literally always free to go. Being trapped in the maze is as much illusion as the danger. The maze simply is, and it's up to the player to determine how deeply they wish to get into it. I love the art style and the ideas at play in Half-Quake, but by design, they drive you up the fucking wall with frustration to actually play them. I took Mudasheep's hint. He did good work, but I wouldn't want to ever actually be trapped within his work. And if you need to escape, there's a key on your keyboard for that. Some places, no matter how hostile, you just want to be in, though. Games have a special advantage in portraying the impossible, and when a game designer is skilled enough to make the impossible appear natural, you're in for a meaningful experience. Adam Foster's Someplace Else is unlike many of the mods in this survey. It is just one map. One pretty much perfectly engaging map. Tonally, there are similarities between Someplace Else and Half-Quake, a narrator guide with a disdain for the player and a philosophical skepticism of the player, along with a series of puzzles guarding an exit and intentionally brutal combat situations. Yet Someplace Else doesn't use its unreality to get the player riled up. It uses it to fully engage the player's sense of wonder and curiosity. If Adam Foster had done Zen levels for the original Half-Life, I think it would be regarded as one of the better portions of the game and not the most janky. His sense of naturalism, of creating placefulness that seems to exist whether or not the player is there to witness it, is remarkable. His Half-Life 2 mod, Minerva Metastasis, got him a job at Valve. Someplace Else is a strong contender too, although much less ambitious than Metastasis. Instead, it's a perfect miniature companion piece for Half-Life. It's a love letter to the things that make the game so iconic. Its realistic mood, the strangeness of its alien vistas, the thrill of its punchy combat. And it does all this within the technical confines of a single map with no loading screen. It has the architectural creativity of Timeline, the philosophical playfulness of Half-Quake, the visual fidelity of Poke 646, and it only takes 20 minutes to play. All these mods we've looked at together, they're a jumble of red-hot creativity. Half-Life changed the face of gaming, and then gamers kept changing the face of Half-Life, over and over again, each collision of amateur designers with the professional toolset of Gold Source producing a unique and unpredictable result. When I was growing up, I didn't have a real gaming budget to speak of, but I did have Half-Life. Where I would have been shut out of new releases until they trickled down to the bargain rack, I had total access to the creative output of all of these modders, working more or less for free, unknown and unsung, except by the grateful fellow fans across the internet. Modding has since become an expected part of the game experience for most games. Fallout 4 will have compatibility on Xbox for mods designed on the PC, for example. But back in the day, these mods felt as fresh and unexpected and revolutionary as the day Gordon first set foot in the Anomalous Materials Lab. This video is my thanks to the community of Half-Life 1. Modders put everything they had into these experiences, and they're still here, still playable, still free, still worthwhile. Some of these games have been lodged in my imagination for 15 years. I can't give a recommendation higher than that. Thanks for watching.
I want to take this moment to thank by name the people who are currently crowdfunding me at $10 a month or more. I appreciate all the help I get, but these people give me a particularly large amount of it, so thank you. People like Cassie, Comfy Hat, Ron Gervais, Christian Zacharianson, Pat Hay, Soeb Sheik, Balder Carlson, Dennis Clark, Nick Cole Hamilton, Kevin DeBolt, Jake Brennan, Ken Young, Dalton Seiler, Brian Hill, Igor Babyuk, Niles D. McDonald, Justin Hughes, Kumaran Vijian, Nobody, Andrew Steele, Tom, Jared Meyer, Jack Harvey, Sharif Kazemi, Ariel Badger Release, Trivium Art History, Jason K., Rob Tackett, Martin Markov, Gordon Moon, Jake Dobbs, Pay, Divya Faust, Grenville Wilson, Pierce McBride, Colby Howard, Camel, John Walsh, Lee Jones, Daniel Mower Myrie, Alex Zalato, Brandon Boat, Stephen Premmel, Matthew, Nathan Campbell, Devin Fitzpatrick, Jake Maya, Sasha Aya, Stephen Potyak, Angel-Headed Hipster, Simo Pawlikowski, Todd Martin, Paul Cocker, Warren, Matthew Zender, Dylan Sibley, Cameron Jackson, David Fry, David Reed, Josh, Boris Nielsen, Michael Atwell, Cameron, Alexander Leister, David Gilbreth, I Cannot Fly, Wesley M., Aaron Albach, Alexander Heavens, Noah Duggins, Martin Karsten, Galak, Brett Galmo, Martin Sconning, Andreas Larson, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Colin, Brad Carr, Ivan Marinov, Josh Parks, Chris Larkey, Aiden AK-47, Dewey, Annex of Rhodes, Niels Bachfrummer, Spyro Sedaris, Rob Clark, Harley McAvoy, Carl Gleason, Tim Marsh, Joshua Vivi, Tizar Vicarian, Irvin, Joe Hewison, Brad Smith, Connor Biblo, Brad Wallace, Ryan Gunst, Preston Allen, Stephen Lark, Amir Aguilar, Jeffrey Knudsen, D, Kimmo Heikkinen, Joe Wolf, Sangustin, Oliver Handlikin, White Zero, and Yuri Petnis. Thanks again, I really appreciate it.
Life song and dance in a lot of sparsely decorated rooms and corridors. In the immediate moment, it's not always so fun. Getting stuck is a serious bore in Timeline 2, and because of the item scarcity problem, to really come out ahead, you might have to go back 2 or 3 combat encounters and not just one, supposing you actually saved your game back then and such. Designing at an expert level of difficulty is part of what makes Ross Smith's level so individual to him, though. This is the way that Smith thinks that combat should be paced. High tension, high stakes, all the time. No good comes from bumbling around. The game tells you that the fate of worlds is on the line, so you better goddamn well aim your gun like it is. Ultimately, the miserly item placement does make your progress feel hard-won, and since you travel so far in terms of miles over the course of the mod, it does add weight to your journey. At the end of London, you fight your way into the tube and board a bullet train to Switzerland. The game even depicts your rail journey in brief montage. All with mostly custom textures and resources, not just the standard Half-Life toolset. Timeline 2, The Iced Earth, is a major part of the reason I wanted to do this video, on account of this tremendous expression of scope using these very slim resources. It just doesn't seem right to me that something with such craft and considered design should be forgotten and collect dust. These mods are every bit as worth spending time on as a cult classic movie from the black and white era. Yeah, the special effects are dated, but the sense of true passion is still woven throughout. Timeline 3 is something else entirely. It takes the best of both mods. It takes the epic scope of your journey and focus on urban design and extreme architecture that characterizes Timeline 2, and mixes in the playfulness of plot and level sequencing as you move through time from the original mod. It is superior to both, though, and I'd consider it my favorite Half-Life 1 mod of them all. It's the ferocity of vision Ross Smith has for his trilogy that makes it so unique and incredible. He explores 7 distinct and sprawling time periods, from late 19th century London to the year 5 billion and beyond, and finally back around to Black Mesa in 1998, where Smith loops his trilogy in with the original Half-Life campaign in the climax. It's not the most technically polished mod. Its ambition wasn't to make the best-looking Gold Source mod. Its ambition was to finish off the story in as grand a style as possible for essentially a one-man team. It is larger than his skill right here in the first installment. In it, Gordon Freeman is doing more teleporter experiments at Black Mesa when he's attacked by Nazis from another dimension. Instead of leading to Zen, they had tunneled into a dangerous alternate reality. Over the course of the mod, Freeman journeys from Black Mesa to a Third Reich version of the same, uses that teleporter, and disrupts Nazi experiments in ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, and the American Civil War. It's a good 3 hours of play for the mod. Everything takes place over an extended period of time and over a long journey through the maps, and in regards to the pacing, Smith really nailed the feeling of classic Half-Life. Ultimately, though, it's that fidelity to the base game that's the big negative for Timeline 1. The corridors and soldiers don't distinguish themselves well. They feel generic. When Smith is making his own textures and being clever with the look and feel of a level, particularly notable in the Rome and Egypt levels, it's a hoot. It feels engaging and distinct, albeit in a way that's handicapped by the fact that he's using, essentially, a deluxe version of the Quake engine. But I'm drawn in by it, especially by its simplicity. Obviously, no one would ever say that Timeline 1 has a graphically vivid depiction of the distant past, but as far as its coherency and charisma as a game go, those elements run strong. The other thing that distinguishes Timeline from Half-Life is that it's designed for enthusiasts and skilled players, so crafts its combat encounters and item placement in a way that's much harsher and less forgiving than the original campaign. Ammunition is particularly scarce, as is health, and you'll have to be miserly about both from the very beginning to the end to get through the experience alive. Similarly, the level design is a little vague at times in terms of flow. It isn't as interested in telegraphing where you should go as much as something for a wider audience. This is for people who want complexity in map making, and buddy, you got it. Ross Smith, even in this first mod, has a flair for mazes. The space always seems logical, part of a larger unseen whole, but it's still clearly meant to get the player thinking and doing some fancy footwork to actually advance through it. Plus, Smith has an excellent sense of rhythm as a level designer, moving very swiftly between different design aesthetics and layouts, chaotic underground cavern, branching facility corridors, and the goofily small Nazi-controlled White House. The White House is actually a great little piece of mod making in microcosm. It's not remotely designed to be a realistic
In this video, I'm going to be looking at single-player mods for the original Half-Life. We're going to be looking at how they all use the same toolset of the Gold Source engine to produce wildly different creative results. These mods run the whole spectrum, from unofficial sequels to really random weird stuff that I don't think you'd expect unless you already knew about it. Anyway, let's get deeper.
Half-Life was a revolutionary title when it came out, but the game itself was only half the revolution. One of Half-Life's greatest legacies isn't the elements of its own design, the professional Half-Life experience, but the legacy of hundreds of modders who took the programming tools of Half-Life and lovingly crafted their own visions of what could be done with the Gold Source engine. Some of them have nothing to do with Half-Life, others seek to make unofficial expansions to the story, and still others strike a balance between elements of the base game and their own creative priorities. Ross Smith's timeline is one of those sorts. It takes Gordon Freeman, the teleporter experiments, and then moves them in new and exciting directions. The first timeline mostly uses textures and animations from the vanilla Half-Life, but it's a particularly bright and memorable example of the early exploratory work being done by modders. Ross Smith made a trilogy out of Timeline, and each mod outdoes the last by a good margin. Timeline 1 is comparatively short and quaint, and that is much of the charm. Unlike the official expansions, like Opposing Force, single-player mods have all kinds of rough edges, janky bits, and moments of glaring cheapness. The fun of these visible seams is that you actually get to see how everything was stitched together. Where a polished game seems right in a general way and demands a little picking apart to see how it all comes together, these one-man shows in the single-player mod scene wear their designs right on their sleeves. Timeline 1 is a big, but slightly hesitant step away from Half-Life, and Smith struggles with making his levels express everything that he's trying to get across. His ambitious, outstanding world-building and creativity in the Neo Ice Age are in for the bulk of the mod. You begin in the alternate universe version of the Black Mesa facility, but Smith's gone out of his way this time around to make sure that it feels genuinely different from the original Black Mesa. The machinery is bulkier, less impressive, the trams are more cheaply produced. There are more distinct buildings as opposed to the endless sprawl of corridors of the classic Black Mesa facility. Architecturally, this alternate Black Mesa is much more vertical and scaled down to human sizes. Really, it's no wonder that the aliens mopped up so easily. It's kinda small. It gives the impression of a harsh and frozen world that was just barely hanging on before the invasion. It's been stuck in my memory ever since I played it years and years ago, and I was surprised about how much of Timeline 2 was still familiar when I replayed it. A lot of the cheapness of Timeline 1 is gone, and what's done with the architecture in Timeline 2 is as novel as it is interesting. Within the facility, you find a rocket that will carry you into space, where you dock at an orbital platform. The space station sequence is the most amateurish looking of the mod, kind of a blocky derivative vibe. You're out of there pretty quick, though, and then on to the game's best sequence, where you rocket back to Earth and look for survivors in what's left of London. The London levels are a beautiful experiment in urban level design on a severe labor budget. Like the White House in Timeline 1, London can only suggest the space, not compellingly demonstrate it, but it's a hell of a strong suggestion. From your crash site on the city's outskirts, the dead cities take shape in your mind as you take the limited and linear journey that Smith had the time and ability to put into the mod. It's more than enough. From the sun shining through the windows of a shuttered bank, to the new deep background textures of twisted, broken skyscrapers, to jumping a truck across a scaled-down London bridge, Gordon Freeman in Ice Age London turns out to be kind of a genius idea. The only downside is the difficulty. Even more than the first, you seem to run up against many more enemies than you actually have bullets for. Since Half-Life 1 isn't shy about draining your health out very quickly even on the easier difficulties, this can mean repeating a lot of segments. The thing about a mod like this is that it's fun and compelling to appreciate in aggregate. All the good moments, the surprising moments, the moments where you felt like you tuned in to what the modder was trying to let you experience. Moment to moment, though, you're doing the same old Half-Life stand-in for the original in terms of space and scale, but it's just similar enough to give the impression of the place, to have the player go along with it and say, okay, Nazis in the White House, obviously a problem. It accomplishes the same kind of world-building and expression of place as a more professional title, it just does so with an absolute minimum of resources. There's something so compelling in that. How big a story can you tell with the smallest of resource investments? That's not saying Smith didn't invest himself in the project. He absolutely did. But come on, this is clearly the community theater version of Half-Life. It's not a retail product. It's a gift from a fan with his own vision to other fans hungry for more Half-Life. That's why it's safe to call Timeline 1 worthwhile, even after almost 2 decades. It's an enthusiastically goofy, incredibly detailed game experience done by one man with leftover bits and pieces from the original game and a handful of custom elements. Timeline 1 was also one of the first major single-player mods, coming about a year after the original Half-Life did. As the scene grew in scope and ambition, so too did Ross Smith's Timeline mods. Timeline 2, The Iced Earth, supposes that, having seemingly stopped the time-traveling Nazis in the last game, Freeman is called upon by the G-Man to address another threat from an alternate reality. In another Black Mesa, on another Earth, an ice age has been consuming the world for hundreds of years. When the experiment opened a portal to Zen, like in the primary game, the frozen world was easy picking for the interdimensional invaders. The Freeman in that world is already dead. So it's up to you to finish what a different you started and save the world for the first time again. Iced Earth immediately puts you in a setting that's a lot different from the last mod in the series, and it does a great job of catching attention right away. There's nothing quite like Timeline 2 anywhere else in the mod community, very little like it in gaming at large. Timeline 3 goes in a more traditionally H.G. Wells kind of a direction, and the first timeline is a little amateurishly simple in the setup, but the second one hooks into a totally different pacing setup than the others and does really well by it. Instead of weaving your way from epoch to epoch, you're in for a globe-trotting adventure that mostly stays in the Frozen's post-apocalypse. Towards the end of the mod, there's more stuff with Zen and the Nazis, but those elements get much more attention and are explored better in Timeline 3. I want to focus on Timeline